Welcome to Lady Mythos. Tonight we explore Morgan le Fay, also known as Morgan or Morgana. Chapter 1. They called her a witch, but that wasn't her beginning. They called her a witch, but when the king was dying, she was the one they trusted. That's how most people meet Morgan le Fay, a dark figure at the edge of Camelot, a woman wrapped in shadow, whispering spells, pulling kingdoms apart from behind the curtain. But here's the part that never quite makes sense. If she was only a villain, why was she the one they brought the king to when he was dying? Not a priest, not his knights, not even Merlin. Morgan, the same woman they warned everyone about, the same woman they said could not be trusted. That contradiction is where her story actually begins. Not in darkness, but in doubt. So if you enjoy stories that don't give easy answers, make sure you're subscribed and stay with me. Long before the war, before the whispers, before anyone feared her name, there was only a girl standing at the edge of something she didn't fully understand. You wouldn't notice anything unusual at first. She looked like anyone else raised near power. Quiet, observant, watching more than speaking. But there was always something slightly off in the way she paid attention. Not distracted, focused. Too focused. While others laughed, she listened. While others spoke, she studied. And sometimes, she noticed things she shouldn't have. A servant once dropped a cup across the stone floor. It shattered loudly enough to turn every head in the room. Everyone flinched. Except Morgan. She was already looking at it before it hit the ground. As if she knew. Not guessed. Knew. That was the first time someone felt it. That small, uncomfortable shift you can't explain, but you don't forget either. Moments like that started stacking quietly around her. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. A door opening before someone touched it. A candle flickering the wrong way. A silence that stretched too long when she entered a room. People didn't call it magic, not yet. They called it coincidence. And they said it with just enough force to convince themselves. But there was one place where those moments didn't feel wrong. Near water. Near stillness. Near the places where the world seemed to slow down and listen instead of rush forward. Morgan would stand there for long stretches of time, saying nothing, doing nothing anyone else could see. And yet, something about her looked less alone. As if the silence around her wasn't empty. As if it was answering. That's the part no one in Camelot quite knew what to do with. Because it didn't look dangerous. It didn't look unnatural. It just didn't belong to them. There are stories, quiet ones, that say she didn't find that place by accident. That something called her there. Not loudly, not in words, but in the same way tides move without asking permission. And once she felt it, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Not because she wanted power, because she recognized something. something that felt more like home than anything she had known before. That's the version of Morgan most people never hear, not the woman in black, not the name spoken with warning. Just someone standing at the edge of a different world, realizing, slowly, that it might be the only place she truly belonged. And that realization changes everything. Because once you know there is another way of seeing the world, you can't pretend you don't see it. Much later, they would say she chose darkness, that she turned, that she became something dangerous. But standing here, at the beginning, that's not what this looks like. This looks like someone being chosen by something older than Camelot, something quieter, something patient, and maybe something that never really intended to let her go. And depending on how you see her, you might not agree with what she did. That was the moment everything started moving, even if no one around her realized it yet. Because the story they would later tell, the one about the witch, the enemy, the woman who helped break a kingdom, it only works if you forget this part. If you forget that before she was feared, she was seen. Not by people, by something else entirely. And if that's true, then maybe the real question isn't when Morgan became dangerous. Maybe the real question is, was she ever meant to belong to Camelot at all? Chapter 2. Before she was feared, she was chosen. Before Morgan became a name people whispered, she was noticed. Not in the way beauty is noticed, not in the way power draws attention. Something quieter than that, something harder to explain. It didn't arrive all at once. No sudden revelation, no moment where the world stopped and pointed at her. It built slowly, in small interruptions. A nobleman walking past her mid-conversation, forgetting what he was about to say. A servant pausing at a doorway, hand hovering as if unsure whether to continue. A priest losing his place in a blessing just for a second. Nothing dramatic, but it kept happening, and always around her. Morgan didn't ask about it. She didn't need to. She was already watching. That was always the difference. Other people reacted. Morgan observed. She began to notice patterns, not just in people, in moments. In the way certain spaces felt heavier than others. In the way silence sometimes lasted longer than it should. In the way still places didn't feel empty. Water especially. There was a part of a castle most people ignored. Not forbidden, just forgotten. Stone walls worn smooth with time. Air cooler than the rest of the halls. At the centre of it, a basin. Always still. Morgan found herself returning there without deciding to. At first, she told herself it was curiosity. But after a while, that explanation didn't hold. One night, long after the castle had gone quiet, she stood in front of the basin again. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint sound of her own breathing. She looked into the water. Her reflection looked back, unmoving. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something felt off. Not visibly, not in a way she could point to, but the longer she looked, the more certain she became the reflection wasn't quite keeping up with her. Most people would have stepped back. Morgan leaned closer. That decision matters. Her fingers hovered over the surface, close enough to disturb it, close enough to stop. She didn't. The moment her skin touched the water, everything stilled. Not ripples, not movement. Stillness. Deeper than before. The reflection disappeared, just for a second. And in that second, something else was there. Not a face, not something she could describe later, but something aware. It didn't move, didn't reach, didn't threaten. It simply saw her. Morgan pulled her hand back. The surface returned instantly. Her reflection again. Nothing unusual. Nothing anyone else would believe. But the room felt different now. Or maybe she did. When she stepped back into the corridor, everything looked the same. Same walls, same silence. But it felt smaller. Like she had just stepped outside of it, without leaving. She didn't tell anyone. Not because she was afraid, because there was nothing to explain. What would she even say? That something in the water had looked back at her? That it hadn't felt strange, only familiar? That's the part that stayed with her. Not fear. Recognition. After that night, the small things didn't feel random anymore. They connected, subtly, like threads pulling in the same direction. People noticed something had changed. They couldn't name it, but they felt it. Morgan didn't speak differently, didn't act differently. But being near her started to feel deliberate, as if something was paying attention through her. Still, no one called her dangerous, not yet, because she hadn't done anything, and that made it harder to justify the feeling. Much later, they would say she went looking for power, that she chose it, that she reached too far. But standing here, that's not what it looks like. It looks like something noticed her first, and once something like that does, it doesn't forget. Morgan didn't run from it, didn't deny it, didn't try to convince herself it wasn't real. She went back. Again and again. Not chasing. Listening. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, without anything dramatic changing, her place in the world shifted. She wasn't just part of it anymore. She was connected to something beneath it. That's the kind of change no one sees at first. No visible sign, no clear moment. Just a quiet certainty growing in the background. And one day, without saying it out loud, everyone around her began to understand the same thing. Morgan was no longer someone you could fully explain. And that kind of person never stays harmless for long. Chapter 3. Avalon. The place she was never meant to leave. By the time Morgan was sent to Avalon, it didn't feel like exile. It felt like something returning her. No one in Camelot said that out loud. They called it training, guidance, a place for gifted women to learn discipline. But the moment she arrived, those explanations stopped mattering. Avalon didn't feel like a place you enter. It felt like something you step into, and it closes quietly behind you. The air was different. Not colder, not warmer, just slower. Sound didn't travel the same way. Footsteps softened before they fully landed. Even voices seemed to settle instead of echo. Morgan noticed it immediately. Not with surprise, with recognition. The island didn't welcome her. It didn't need to. It simply allowed her to remain. That was enough. The women of Avalon didn't greet her like visitors are greeted. No ceremony, no warmth meant to reassure. They looked at her once, measured, then returned to what they were doing. Morgan understood. This wasn't a place where you were accepted. You were observed. Her training began the next morning, or what passed for morning there. Time didn't feel stable enough to measure properly. No books, no lessons, no instructions. She was brought to the water and left there. At first, it felt like nothing, hours passing without direction. The surface of the lake unmoving, reflecting sky and mist without interruption. Most would have grown restless. Morgan stayed. She began to notice things, small at first. The difference between wind touching the surface and something moving beneath it. The way light shifted when clouds passed, and the way it didn't when something else interrupted it. It wasn't about seeing more, it was about seeing correctly. Days passed like that, or something like days. Eventually, one of the women approached her, the same one who had been watching since her arrival. "You're waiting for it to show you something," the woman said. Morgan didn't look away from the water. "It already is." The woman didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. That was the first lesson. Not magic, not power. Patience. From there, things began to shift. Not quickly, but deliberately. Morgan was taught to heal. Not gently, not as kindness. She was shown wounds that couldn't be seen from the surface. Illness that didn't respond to simple remedies. Pain that lingered because no one had understood it properly. She learned where to place her hands, where not to. More importantly, she learned when to stop. That part mattered more than anything else, because Avalon didn't reward interference. It demanded precision. One evening, she was called to assist with a patient brought from beyond the island. A man barely conscious, breathing shallow, skin pale in a way that meant something inside had already started failing. The others worked around him in silence. Measured movements. No wasted effort. Morgan stepped forward instinctively, reached toward him. Wait. The voice was quiet, but it stopped her completely. The older woman shook her head once. Morgan looked back at the man. He was slipping. Anyone could see that. "Help him," Morgan said. "We are," the woman replied. But they weren't. Not the way Morgan understood it. They were watching, measuring, waiting. The man's breathing slowed further, weaker. Then, it stopped. Silence. Morgan stared. Not at the body, at the stillness that followed. No one reacted. Not immediately. Then, calmly, the women covered him, as if nothing unexpected had happened. Morgan stepped back, something inside her resisting the quiet acceptance of it. "You could have saved him," she said. The older woman met her gaze. "No," she said. "Not without taking something we weren't meant to take." Morgan didn't respond, but she didn't forget. That moment stayed with her, because it revealed something Avalon never said directly. Not everything that can be done should be done. Morgan understood the lesson. She just didn't agree with it. And that difference began to grow, quietly, under everything she learned. Her skill sharpened quickly, faster than the others. Where they hesitated, she moved. Where they measured, she understood. The island noticed, even if no one said it. The same woman found her again one evening, standing by the water. "You learn too fast," she said. Morgan didn't look at her. "Is that a problem?" The woman studied her for a moment. "It will be." Morgan finally turned. "Why?" The answer came without hesitation. "Because you won't stay where we stop." Silence settled between them. Morgan looked back at the lake, the surface calm, unbroken. But she already knew. There was more beneath it. Avalon had given her discipline, clarity, control. But it had also shown her its limits. And Morgan had never been someone who ignored what lay just beyond a boundary. When she finally left the island, she didn't leave uncertain. She didn't leave searching. She left knowing two things clearly: what she could do and what she was not being taught. Avalon had shaped her. That part was true. But it had also held something back. And Morgan had already decided she wasn't going to leave it there. Chapter 4. She learned the magic others were forbidden to touch. Avalon didn't forbid things openly. That would have been easier. There were no warnings carved into stone, no doors marked "Do not enter," no lessons that ended with "This is where you stop." Instead, certain things were simply not continued. A lesson would begin, go far enough to be useful, then end just before it became something else. Morgan noticed it quickly. Not because she was looking for secrets, because she could feel where something had been cut short. Healing, for example. They showed her how to close wounds, how to slow bleeding, how to ease pain just enough for the body to recover. But there were moments, small ones, where the work paused, where the others stepped back even though the wound hadn't fully given up its hold. Morgan felt it every time. That edge, that almost. She didn't question it out loud. She watched. Patterns began to form, not in what they taught, but in what they refused to finish. And once you see that clearly, it starts to pull at you. There were parts of the island that reflected the same thing. Paths that curved away instead of continuing. Spaces that were used less often, even though nothing was wrong with them. Not forbidden, avoided. One evening, when the mist sat lower than usual, Morgan followed one of those paths. Not quickly, not like someone sneaking. She walked the way she had been taught, aware, listening. The air changed before the space revealed itself. Heavier, stiller. Then the ground dipped slightly, and there it was. A circle carved into stone, worn smooth with time, older than anything else she had seen on the island. No markings, no symbols, nothing to explain it, and yet it didn't feel empty. Morgan stopped at the edge. She didn't step in. Not yet. There's always a moment like this. Not fear, not hesitation. Something more precise. Understanding. Once you cross, you don't stand in the same place again. She stepped forward anyway. The shift was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. The air pressed differently against her skin. Her breath slowed without effort. The quiet deepened into something that felt attentive. Morgan stood still, let it settle. Nothing happened. She waited. That's when it began. Not with movement, with awareness. The same feeling she had known at the basin, at the water, in the still places. Only stronger now. Closer. It wasn't outside her, not entirely. It was aligned with her. Morgan closed her eyes, and something opened. Not a vision, not images, understanding. She felt the shape of what they hadn't taught her. How the same control used to heal could hold instead of release. How slowing something down could become stopping it entirely. How pain could be eased or deepened, not wildly, not chaotically, precisely. Morgan opened her eyes. The circle hadn't changed. The island hadn't reacted. But she knew. This was the part they had left unfinished. Not because it didn't belong to Avalon, because it demanded something beyond discipline. Choice. A sound behind her broke the stillness. You shouldn't be here. Morgan turned. The older woman stood just beyond the edge of the circle. She hadn't rushed, hadn't called out earlier. She had let Morgan step in. You knew I would come, Morgan said. The woman didn't deny it. That doesn't mean you understand what you're stepping into. Morgan glanced back at the carved stone beneath her feet. I understand enough. The woman's gaze sharpened slightly. That's what makes it dangerous. Morgan stepped out of the circle, slowly, not retreating, just leaving it where it was. What is it? She asked. The woman held her gaze. A boundary, she said. Morgan considered that. Or a decision. The silence that followed was different, heavier, because they both knew those weren't the same thing. You don't come back from this kind of understanding unchanged, the woman said. Morgan didn't argue. She already felt it. The shift wasn't dramatic. No surge of power, no visible mark. Just clarity. The kind that doesn't leave space for pretending you don't know what you're capable of. Will you stop? the woman asked. Morgan didn't answer right away. For the first time, she considered it. Not out of doubt, out of precision. Then she shook her head once. No explanation, no defiance, just truth. The woman watched her for a long moment, then stepped back. Not approval, not surrender. Acceptance. Morgan left the path behind her, returned to the parts of Avalon that felt familiar, structured, controlled. But something had shifted, quietly, irreversibly. The lessons didn't feel the same anymore. Where others saw completion, she saw restraint. Where they stopped, she saw continuation. And she didn't resent it. She understood it, which made it easier to move beyond it. Morgan didn't use what she had learned, not immediately. That's what makes this moment matter. She didn't lose control, didn't rush to test it. She waited. And once knowledge becomes something you choose when to use, it stops being something anyone else can take away from you. That was the real shift. Not power. Freedom. Chapter 5. The King's Sister, who refused to kneel. When Morgan returned to Camelot, it wasn't the place that had changed. It was the distance between her and it. Everything looked the same. The halls were still full. Voices still carried too far. Decisions were still made quickly, confidently, and often without being questioned. But now, she noticed the gaps. Not flaws, not mistakes. Gaps. The kind you only see once you've stood somewhere else long enough to understand what's missing. She didn't announce it, didn't challenge anyone the moment she arrived. She watched. That was enough. People felt it before they understood it. The way she listened, the way she didn't interrupt, the way she didn't rush to agree the way others did. It made conversations shift slightly off balance. Arthur noticed it immediately. He always had. Their first real conversation happened away from the court. Not in front of advisors, not where anyone else could listen. A private chamber, window open, late light stretching across the stone floor. Arthur stood near the window, looking out, as if the courtyard below might offer something clearer than the room behind him. Morgan didn't speak first. She rarely needed to. "You've changed," he said. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't neutral either. Morgan leaned lightly against the stone wall. "Have I?" Arthur turned to face her, studied her for a moment longer than usual. "Yes," he said. "You don't hesitate anymore." Morgan almost smiled. "I used to?" Arthur didn't answer that. Instead, he stepped closer. "There are things you don't understand yet," he said, "about how this works." Morgan met his gaze, calm, steady. "Then explain it," she said. Arthur hesitated, just slightly. That hesitation said more than anything he could have explained. "It's not that simple," he replied. Morgan pushed off the wall and stepped closer. "It never is," she said. "But that doesn't mean it works." The air in the room shifted, not because of what she said, because she said it without lowering her voice, without softening it. Arthur's expression tightened, not in anger, in restraint. "You're questioning everything," he said. Morgan tilted her head slightly. "I'm noticing it." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but not easy either. Arthur looked away first, back toward the window. "This place holds together because people trust it," he said. "Because they believe in it." Morgan followed his gaze. "Do they?" she asked quietly. Arthur turned back sharply this time. "You think they don't?" Morgan didn't raise her voice, didn't push. "I think they don't question it," she said. "That's not the same thing." That landed, because Arthur knew the difference. He just couldn't afford to agree with it. "You're not wrong," he said, after a moment. Morgan didn't react. "But that doesn't make you right, either." That was the closest he could come, and she knew it. From that point on, things didn't break between them. They stretched. Not openly, not dramatically, but every conversation carried more weight than it used to. In court, Morgan didn't interrupt, didn't speak over anyone. She waited. And when she spoke, people listened. Not because they agreed, because they weren't sure what she would say. That unpredictability unsettled them. There was a moment, not long after her return, when it became impossible to ignore. Two nobles stood before Arthur, arguing over land. Voices raised, claims repeated, both convinced they were justified. Arthur listened carefully, asked questions, weighed both sides the way he always did. Morgan stood near the edge of the room, watching. When Arthur gave his ruling, it was balanced, fair, the kind of decision that kept peace in the moment. Morgan stepped forward. "That won't hold," she said. The room went still. Arthur didn't react immediately, but the shift was immediate. "Explain," he said. Morgan glanced at the two men, then back to Arthur. "They'll agree now," she said, "because they have to." She nodded slightly toward one of them. "He'll ignore it the moment it benefits him." Then the other. "And he won't let that go." Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. Arthur held his gaze. "You're certain?" "Yes." A long pause followed. This was the kind of moment that defined a king. Not the decision, what he did with contradiction. He could dismiss her. He could reinforce authority. He could ignore her completely. Instead, he adjusted the ruling. Not completely, just enough. The room shifted again. Not relief, not approval, recognition. Morgan had done something no one else dared to do. She didn't challenge Arthur in private. She corrected him in front of everyone. And he allowed it. That changed things. After that, people didn't look at her the same way. They didn't avoid her, not openly, but they became careful. Words were chosen more precisely. Conversations ended sooner. Decisions happened faster when she wasn't present. Morgan noticed. She didn't try to fix it, didn't soften herself, didn't step back. That part mattered, because she could have made it easier. She knew how. She chose not to. Arthur felt it too. Not as rebellion, as pressure. Every decision now carried a second layer, not spoken, but there. And once that layer exists, it doesn't disappear. Morgan didn't oppose Camelot, not directly, but she stopped supporting it in the way it expected. And sometimes, that's where the real shift begins. Not in breaking something, in refusing to hold it together. Chapter 6. The Betrayal That Changed Everything. Up until this point, Morgan had only pushed, questioned, challenged, refused to bend. But she hadn't broken anything that couldn't be repaired. Not yet. That changes here. And it doesn't happen in a battle. It happens in a room. Quiet, private, controlled. The kind of place where damage doesn't look dramatic, but lasts longer than any wound. Morgan didn't expect betrayal. That's what makes it real. She expected resistance, disapproval, distance. Those were predictable. Those she could work with. But betrayal is different. Because it comes from the part of your world you didn't think would turn on you. It started with whispers. Not loud enough to confront, not clear enough to prove. Just small shifts in tone. A conversation ending too quickly when she entered. A look exchanged between advisors that didn't include her anymore. Decisions being made without her. Morgan noticed. Of course she did. But she didn't react. Not immediately. Because this didn't feel like open opposition. It felt organized. And that's worse. The truth revealed itself slowly, not all at once. A message delivered too late. A meeting she wasn't told about. A recommendation she made, quietly dismissed. Each one small. Individually, nothing. Together, a pattern. Someone wasn't arguing with her anymore. They were removing her. The moment it becomes undeniable doesn't come with anger. It comes with clarity. Morgan stood outside a chamber she had been called to countless times before. The door was closed. Voices inside. Familiar ones. Arthur. And others. She didn't enter. Not yet. She listened. She's becoming a problem. Not shouted. Not emotional. Measured. She's already influencing decisions. Another voice. Calm. Controlled. Arthur didn't answer immediately. That silence said more than anything else. Morgan didn't move. Didn't interrupt. She challenges everything, the first voice continued. And not in a way we can manage. A pause. Then Arthur, finally. She's my sister. It wasn't a defense. Not really. It was a complication. That's exactly the issue, someone replied. Silence again. Longer this time. Morgan waited. Just a second longer. Then she opened the door. The room fell quiet instantly. Every eye turned to her. Arthur didn't look surprised. That was the first confirmation. He knew. Morgan stepped inside slowly. No anger, no raised voice, just presence. "You should have invited me," she said. No one answered. That's the second confirmation. Because if this had been a misunderstanding, someone would have corrected it. Arthur finally stepped forward. "We were discussing me," Morgan said. "Not sharp, not emotional, just accurate." Another silence. Morgan looked around the room, took in every face, every expression, every person who had decided something about her without saying it directly. This wasn't confrontation, it was recognition. "You've already decided," she said. Arthur's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." Morgan almost smiled. "It is," she said quietly. And that's when the shift happens. Not loud, not visible, but final. Because Morgan isn't reacting to betrayal. She's accepting it. Arthur stepped closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Morgan looked at him. Really looked at him. Not as a king, not even as a brother. As someone who had just confirmed something she hadn't wanted to believe. "You're trying to control something you don't understand," she said. Arthur's expression hardened slightly. "That's exactly what you're doing." That line lands, because for a moment, they're saying the same thing about each other, and neither of them is wrong. That's what makes this moment irreversible. Morgan didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't try to fix it. She stepped back, and in that step, something closed. "You won't include me anymore," she said. Arthur didn't answer. "That's the answer." Morgan nodded once, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked out. No one stopped her. That matters, because this wasn't exile. Not officially. But it might as well have been. That's the betrayal. Not that they opposed her, not that they feared her, that they decided she was no longer part of the structure. And Arthur let it happen. That was the moment Camelot lost her. Not to darkness, not to revenge, to distance. Because once someone realizes they no longer belong, they stop protecting what excluded them. Morgan didn't lash out, didn't act immediately, didn't prove them right. She did something far more dangerous. She stepped away. And for the first time since her return, she stopped trying to hold anything together. That shift doesn't look like destruction. Not yet. It looks like absence. And absence creates space. Space for things to fall. That's what Camelot failed to understand. They thought removing Morgan would stabilize the system, make things easier, safer, more predictable. But Morgan had never been the instability. She had been the pressure holding certain things in place. The moment she stepped away, those things didn't disappear. They started moving. Quietly, uncontrolled. And no one noticed how much had already begun to change. Not until it was too late to reverse it. Morgan didn't leave Camelot that night. Not physically. But something else did. And it didn't come back. Chapter 7. The first spell that crossed the line. After that room, after the moment she heard her name spoken like a problem, something in Morgan didn't break. It settled. Not anger, not grief, clarity. She stopped trying to understand where she stood. She already knew. From then on, the court felt different. Not hostile, just arranged. Conversations happened without her. Decisions moved faster when she wasn't there. People were polite, but never fully open. It was controlled distance. Morgan didn't confront it, didn't demand anything back. She let it exist. And in doing so, she stepped outside of it. That's the shift no one noticed clearly. Not at first. She was still present, still calm, still exactly as composed as before. But something had changed in how she moved through the room. She no longer adjusted herself, and that makes people uneasy faster than open defiance ever could. The moment it happens doesn't feel like revenge. It feels precise. A gathering, not formal, not important enough to be remembered later, which made it perfect. Voices filled the space. Laughter moved easily between people who believed they understood each other. Morgan stood near the edge, as she often did now, unnoticed. Across the room, a knight. Well-liked, confident, the kind of man who spoke freely because nothing had ever forced him not to. She had heard enough. Not directly, never to her face, but she didn't need to hear the words. She understood the shape of them. He laughed again, too loudly. Morgan watched him for a moment. Not long, just enough. Then she moved. No one paid attention. That's the advantage of being dismissed quietly. You move without resistance. Their paths crossed naturally, as if it hadn't been planned. The knight nodded at her in passing. Brief, casual, already moving on. Morgan stopped. "Do you believe what you say about me?" she asked. He paused, turned back. The question wasn't loud, but it didn't leave space to ignore it. "I don't say things I don't believe," he replied. There was a flicker of amusement in his voice. Morgan stepped closer. "Then you should be more careful," she said. He smiled, just slightly. "Of you?" Morgan shook her head once. "No." And then she reached out. Not fast, not hidden. Her fingers brushed the edge of his cloak. Nothing happened. For a second, it almost felt like the moment had passed, like the tension had nowhere to go. The knight turned slightly, already losing interest. Then he froze. Not suddenly. Gradually, his breath caught, his shoulders tightened. Heat, not from the room, from him. He reached for his chest, confused, then looked down. The fabric where Morgan had touched it had darkened, spreading slowly outward. A faint line of smoke curled upward. Someone nearby noticed, stopped speaking. The knight pulled at the cloth instinctively. That's when the flame appeared. Not wild, not explosive, controlled. It moved along the fabric like it had direction, like it knew exactly where to go. The knight staggered back, trying to tear the cloak free, but the fire followed the motion. Now the room reacted. Voices broke, chairs scraped, movements scattered. Morgan didn't move. She watched. Not cold, not detached. Focused. The fire climbed just enough, then stopped, abruptly. The knight collapsed to his knees, tearing the cloak from his shoulders, breathing hard, skin reddened where heat had pressed too close. Alive. That detail mattered. Morgan turned before anyone reached him. No rush, no urgency. She moved through the same space she had just disturbed, and it parted for her. Behind her, the noise rose. Questions, confusion, fear, quickly disguised as anger. No one said her name. Not yet. But they were thinking it. By morning, everyone would know. Arthur heard before anyone could soften it. He didn't call her immediately, didn't send for her in anger. That was his way, to understand first. But this time, understanding didn't change anything. When they stood across from each other, there was no confusion left between them. "You did it," he said. Morgan didn't deny it. "You could have killed him." She held his gaze. "I didn't." The answer came too quickly to be defensive, too calmly to be dismissed. Arthur stepped closer. "That's not the point." Morgan tilted her head slightly. "It is." Silence settled between them. Not because there was nothing to say, because everything had already been said. Arthur saw it then. This wasn't a mistake. Not anger, not loss of control. A decision. Measured. Exact. That was the part he couldn't accept. Morgan turned to leave. He didn't stop her. That mattered more than anything else, because in that moment, neither of them tried to undo what had just happened. And once something crosses that line without resistance, it doesn't go back. From that point on, Morgan wasn't a question anymore. She was something the court had to account for, even when she wasn't in the room. And that kind of presence changes everything long before anything else breaks. Chapter 8. Camelot didn't fall in a day. She helped break it. Camelot didn't fall all at once. There was no single night where everything burned, no moment where the kingdom realized it was already too late. It unraveled slowly, and most of it didn't look like destruction. That's what made it harder to stop. After the fire, after the night, people didn't confront Morgan. They adjusted around her. Conversations shifted direction when she approached. Decisions were made faster, often before she could be present. Some doors closed more often than they used to. Not openly. Never openly. Camelot still functioned. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, something had started to slip. Morgan didn't push against it. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, she began doing something far more precise. She started choosing where to intervene. Not everywhere, not often. Just enough. The first time it truly mattered, no one recognized it for what it was. A dispute again, not unlike the one before. Two houses, both loyal, both necessary to the stability of the court. The kind of conflict Arthur usually handled well. This time, Morgan said nothing. That's what made it different. She stood in the room, listened, watched the same patterns unfold, and stayed silent. Arthur noticed. Of course he did. For a moment, he glanced toward her, as if expecting the interruption, the correction. It didn't come. So he made the decision alone. Balanced, fair, clean. The kind of ruling that should have held. It didn't. Within weeks, tensions between the two houses sharpened. Quietly at first, then openly. Agreements bent, promises stretched. Small retaliations followed. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could point to and say, this is where it broke. But it was breaking. Morgan watched it happen. Not with satisfaction, not even with surprise. Recognition. Because she had seen it already. She just hadn't stopped it. That was the difference. And that difference mattered more than anything she had done before. Arthur felt it too. He didn't confront her immediately, but something in the way he looked at her changed. Less certainty, more calculation. You knew, he said to her one evening. No accusation, just a statement. Morgan didn't deny it. Yes. Arthur held his gaze. You said nothing. Morgan stepped closer. You didn't ask. That landed harder than anger would have, because it wasn't wrong. Arthur looked away, just for a second. That's not how this works, he said. Morgan's expression didn't shift. It is now. Silence. That was the moment something between them changed again. Not broken, not yet, but no longer aligned. After that, the court grew sharper, more reactive. Small disagreements escalated faster, alliances became less stable. Trust, once easy, began to feel conditional. Morgan didn't create those fractures, but she stopped holding them together. And without that pressure, they spread. There's a moment most versions of this story don't linger on, because it doesn't look important at first. A message, sent late. A warning about rising tension between two groups near the edge of the kingdom. It reaches Camelot, just a little too late. By the time action is taken, damage has already been done. Nothing catastrophic, but enough. Enough to weaken something that had been stable for years. Arthur reads the report in silence. Morgan stands nearby. She doesn't speak, doesn't offer insight, doesn't correct him. And for the first time, Arthur hesitates. Not about the decision, about her. Because now he doesn't know whether she's choosing silence or shaping outcomes by it. That uncertainty spreads faster than any fire. People begin to wonder the same thing, not openly, but quietly. Is she helping, or is she letting things fall? And more importantly, which is worse? Morgan doesn't answer that. She doesn't need to, because the results are already there. Subtle, untraceable, but real. Camelot still stands. The walls are intact. The court still gathers. The king still rules. But something underneath has started to shift out of place, not because it was attacked, because it was no longer being held steady. Morgan walks through the halls the same way she always has, calm, unhurried, unchanged, at least on the surface. But now, when people see her, they don't just feel uneasy, they hesitate. Not because of what she might do, because of what she might choose not to do. And that kind of uncertainty is harder to defend against than any enemy. Camelot didn't fall that day, but for the first time, it felt like something inside it had started moving in a direction no one fully controlled. And Morgan was no longer standing in the way of it. Chapter 9. Was she ever truly human? By now, people had stopped asking what Morgan was doing. They started asking something else. What she was. Not out loud, not in the court. In quieter places. Servants spoke about her in kitchens, voices lowered without realizing it. Guards exchanged looks when her name came up, then changed the subject too quickly. Even those who had known her for years avoided finishing certain thoughts. It wasn't just fear, it was uncertainty. Because nothing about her behavior fully explained what people were feeling. She hadn't taken power, hadn't declared anything, hadn't even raised her voice, and yet rooms shifted when she entered. Not dramatically, just enough. Like something unseen had stepped in with her. There are moments that don't make it into official stories. Small ones, difficult to prove, but they linger. One of them began in the forest. A hunting party had ridden out early, following tracks deeper than they usually would. The air had been still that morning, the kind of stillness that makes sound carry farther than expected. They saw the stag first, too large, too still, standing at the edge of a clearing, watching them. One of the men raised his bow, another told him to wait. Something about it felt wrong. The stag didn't move, didn't startle, didn't react the way it should have. It just stood there, looking at them. Then it stepped back, not into the forest, into shadow, and for a moment, it was gone. Not running, not fleeing. Gone. The men hesitated, then followed. The clearing was empty. No tracks, no movement, nothing. Except Morgan, standing exactly where the stag had been. No horse, no sound of arrival, just there. No one spoke. They couldn't. Morgan looked at them, calm as ever. "You shouldn't follow things you don't understand," she said. Her voice wasn't threatening, not sharp, but none of them moved. Not until she turned and walked past them. And even then, they waited, just to be sure she was gone. The story spread quietly, not officially, not in court, but it spread. And it changed something. Because it didn't sound like magic. It sounded like something else. Something older. That wasn't the only moment. There were others, less clear, more difficult to explain. A servant swore she saw Morgan standing in one corridor, and then again, moments later, at the far end of another. A guard claimed the temperature dropped when she passed, though no one else reacted. Someone insisted they heard her voice, soft, close, when she wasn't anywhere nearby. Each story on its own could be dismissed. Together, they started forming something. Not evidence, a feeling. Morgan didn't confirm any of it. Didn't deny it either. She moved the same way she always had, but now people watched her differently. Not just for what she might do, for what she might already be. Arthur heard the stories. Of course he did. He dismissed most of them, at least outwardly. But one stayed with him. The forest. He found her not long after, near the edge of the same woods. Not by coincidence. He had gone looking. Morgan stood at the tree line, looking out over the distance, as if she had been there long before he arrived. "You're becoming something people don't understand," he said. Morgan didn't turn. "They never did," she replied. Arthur stepped closer. "This is different." Now she looked at him. "Is it?" He held her gaze, trying to find something familiar in it, something unchanged. "You're not helping them," he said. Morgan's expression didn't shift. "They don't want help." "That's not true." She tilted her head slightly. "They want certainty," she said. "Not truth." Arthur didn't answer that, because he knew there was something in it he couldn't deny. A long silence stretched between them. Then he asked, quietly, "What are you becoming?" Morgan studied him for a moment. Not cold, not distant, just measuring. Then she looked past him, back toward the forest. "I'm not becoming anything," she said. She paused. "I'm just not pretending anymore." That answer didn't settle anything. If anything, it made things worse, because it meant whatever people were starting to see had always been there. They had just missed it, or chosen not to see it. Morgan stepped away from the tree line, walked past Arthur without stopping. He didn't follow. For the first time, he wasn't sure where she was going. And that uncertainty stayed. Not just with him, with all of them. Because once the question shifts from what someone is doing to what they are, you're no longer dealing with something you can control. And Camelot had never learned how to deal with that. Chapter 10. The War Between Blood and Power. By the time the conflict turned into something larger, no one could say exactly when it had begun. There was no declaration, no moment where one side chose war. It grew, quietly. Disputes that should have ended didn't. Alliances that once held shifted. Small acts of defiance became patterns. Then, movement. Forces gathering where they shouldn't. Messages travelling faster than usual. Too many decisions being made too quickly. By the time Camelot responded, it wasn't prevention anymore. It was reaction. Arthur stood at the centre of it, trying to contain something that no longer moved cleanly. And Morgan was no longer at his side. Not in the way she used to be. She still moved through the same spaces, still heard the same reports, still understood the structure of what was happening, But she didn't stand within it. That distance mattered now, because this wasn't a disagreement in court. This was consequence. The first time Morgan saw it clearly was not in Camelot. It was on the edge of the conflict. The land there didn't look like a battlefield. Not yet. Villages still stood. Smoke still rose from chimneys. People still moved, as if life hadn't shifted beneath them. But something was wrong. The quiet was too tight. Morgan walked through it without announcing herself. No guards, no escort. She didn't need one. People noticed her, of course they did. But no one approached. Not out of respect, out of uncertainty. At the edge of one village, she stopped. A man sat against the wall of a stone house, barely conscious, blood soaking through cloth wrapped poorly around his side. Not a soldier, just someone caught in something that had already gone too far. Morgan stepped closer, kneeling beside him. His breathing was uneven, too shallow. She placed her hand near the wound, not touching, measuring. She knew exactly what to do. The knowledge came easily now, too easily. She could slow the bleeding, ease the pain, pull him back from the edge. Or she could do nothing. The difference between those two choices had never felt this clear before. The man shifted slightly, eyes barely opening. He saw her, didn't recognize her, but something in his expression changed. Not fear, expectation. Morgan held there for a moment longer. For a moment, she considered letting him die. Then, she pressed her hand against the wound. The reaction was immediate. His breathing steadied. The tension in his body eased. The blood slowed. Not stopped, just enough. Morgan didn't stay. She stood, stepped back, left him alive, but not safe. That's the difference now. She didn't save him. She chose how much he would survive. And that choice stayed with her as she moved through the rest of the village. This wasn't controlled anymore. Not like the court. This was what happened when systems failed slowly enough that no one stopped them in time. Morgan saw it clearly, and for the first time, she was inside it. Not observing, not predicting. Part of it. By the time she returned to Camelot, the atmosphere had shifted again. Reports were heavier, voices sharper, silences longer. Arthur stood over a table covered in maps, lines drawn hastily across them, marking movement that refused to stay contained. He didn't look up when she entered. "You went out there," he said. Not a question. Morgan stepped closer. "Yes." Arthur's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "And?" Morgan didn't answer immediately. There was too much to say. So she chose something simpler. "It's already happening." Arthur finally looked at her. "I know that." "No," Morgan said quietly. "You know it's begun." She held his gaze. "You don't know what it's becoming." That unsettled him more than any report had. Because it wasn't coming from a messenger. It was coming from her. Arthur stepped closer. "Then tell me," he said. Morgan didn't move. "You can't fix it from here," she said. His expression hardened. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. Silence again. This time heavier. Because both of them understood something they hadn't said out loud yet. This wasn't just about the kingdom. It was about them. Arthur was trying to hold everything together. Morgan had already stepped beyond that. Not against him, not entirely, but no longer aligned with the same goal. "You're letting it happen," he said finally. Morgan's expression didn't change. "I'm not stopping it," she replied. That distinction was thin, but it was enough to create a divide that couldn't be crossed easily. Arthur turned away. For the first time, he didn't try to pull her back into it, and Morgan didn't offer. The war didn't explode overnight. It spread, slow enough that each part still felt manageable, fast enough that no one could catch all of it. And through it, Morgan moved quietly. Not leading, not following, choosing. Where to act, where to remain still. And each choice carried weight, even the ones no one saw. Camelot still stood, but now the cost of holding it together was visible, and Morgan was no longer paying it with them. Chapter 11. The night Arthur vanished without an ending. By the time it reached the end, it didn't feel like victory. There was no moment of triumph, no final stand that restored anything. Just aftermath, the kind that settles quietly. The battlefield had gone still, not empty, still. The air carried the weight of something that had already passed through and taken what it needed. Arthur was still alive. That, in itself, felt uncertain. He lay among what remained of the fight, breath uneven, armor broken where it had failed him. The strength that had held everything together for so long was no longer holding. Around him, the world had already begun to move on. Those who could stand, stood. Those who could leave, left. Those who couldn't, were left behind. No one noticed when she arrived. Morgan didn't come with sound. No horse, no guards. One moment, the field was empty around him. The next, she was there. She stood over him for a long second without speaking. Not distant, not cold, just still. Arthur's eyes opened slowly. It took him a moment to recognize her. Not because she had changed, because everything else had. "You came," he said. It wasn't surprise, something closer to relief. Morgan lowered herself beside him. "I was always going to." No hesitation, no weight behind the words, just truth. Arthur let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "They'll say you did this." Morgan didn't react. "They already do." That answer settled between them without resistance. Arthur turned his head slightly, looking past her at the fading light. "Did I fail?" he asked. Morgan didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know, because the answer wasn't simple enough to give cleanly. "You held it together longer than anyone else could have," she said. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. "That's not the same thing." "No," Morgan said quietly. "It isn't." Silence followed. Not empty, full. Everything that had been said between them, and everything that hadn't. Arthur's breathing shifted again, shallower now. Morgan placed her hand against his chest. Not to heal, to feel. She could still do it. She could slow it, hold him there, pull him back from the edge the way she had done before. The knowledge was clear, immediate. But this time, she didn't move. Arthur watched her. "You're deciding," he said. Morgan met his gaze. Yes. There was no fear in him. That's what made it harder. "Then don't leave me here," he said. It wasn't a plea. It was a request. Morgan's hand remained where it was. "I'm not," she said. And for the first time, something in her voice shifted. Not weakness. Something closer to weight. Arthur's breathing slowed further. "Where, then?" Morgan didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the edge of the water. It hadn't been there before. Not like that. Dark, still, waiting. A boat rested against the shore. No sound of arrival, no sign of who had brought it. It simply existed. Morgan helped him sit up. Carefully. Arthur didn't resist. Whatever strength he had left, he used it to move with her. Not away. With her. She guided him toward the water, step by step. No one stopped them. No one saw them. Or if they did, they didn't understand what they were looking at. At the edge, Arthur paused. The surface didn't reflect the sky anymore. It reflected nothing. He looked at her. "This isn't death," he said. Morgan held his gaze. No. That was enough for him. He stepped into the boat. She followed. The water didn't move as they pushed away. No ripples, no sound. Just distance. The shore faded slowly behind them. Arthur leaned back slightly, the last of his strength leaving him without resistance. Morgan remained beside him, still, watching him. Not as a king, not as a symbol, just as someone she had known before any of this had begun. Arthur's breathing softened, then slowed, then stilled. Morgan didn't move. Not immediately. The boat continued forward, carrying them deeper into the mist. There was no marker for where they were going, no clear destination, only distance from everything behind them. Morgan placed her hand lightly over his chest again. No reaction. For a moment, nothing existed except the quiet. Then she withdrew her hand. Not because she couldn't do anything, because she chose not to. The mist thickened around them. The shore disappeared completely. And with it, everything that had once defined them. The king, the kingdom, the war. All of it fell away, leaving only what remained. And then, even that was gone. By morning, there was no sign of Arthur. No body, no trace. Only a story. That he hadn't died. That he had been taken. And that the one who took him was the same woman they had always feared. But no one could agree on what that meant, and no one ever found where she had gone. Only the water remained, still, as if it had never been disturbed at all. Chapter 12. What Morgan le Fay was never allowed to be. After Arthur vanished, Camelot didn't collapse. Not immediately. That's not how endings usually happen. The court continued. Decisions were still made. People still spoke of order, of rebuilding, of moving forward. But something had changed. Not in the structure, in the way things were remembered. Because once Arthur was gone, his story had to be decided. And so did hers. At first, no one spoke about Morgan directly, not in the open. There were too many questions, too many versions of what had happened. Some said she had taken him. Others said she had saved him. A few insisted she had done both. None of it could be proven. That didn't stop the story from forming. It began quietly, a retelling here, a detail sharpened there, a moment adjusted just enough to feel clearer than it had been. Not lies, just direction. In one version, Morgan stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching, waiting, letting everything fall before stepping in. In another, she had been part of it from the beginning, guiding, pressing, turning events long before anyone noticed. In some, she was colder than anyone remembered. In others, she was never fully human to begin with. Each version solved something. Each version made the story easier to hold. And slowly, the harder parts began to fade. The moments where she had healed, where she had stepped in instead of away, where she had chosen restraint. Those became quieter, less important, because they complicated things. And stories don't like complication when they're trying to survive. There's a scene that began to appear more often than the others. A version of the end. Arthur, broken on the field. Morgan arriving too late, or too early. Or exactly when she intended to. The details changed, but one thing stayed the same. She was always standing. He was always falling. That image held, because it was simple. Because it answered something people didn't want to keep asking. What happened to Camelot? It needed a shape, a direction, a reason. And Morgan became part of that answer. Not the only one, but the easiest to point to. Time passed. The stories settled. Not into truth, into familiarity. People stopped questioning them. Not because they were certain, because they were repeated often enough to feel certain. And Morgan became something fixed. A warning, a shadow, a presence at the edge of power. But never the whole story, because the whole story doesn't sit still like that. There were still contradictions that didn't disappear. The way Arthur had spoken to her at the end, the fact that he had gone with her, the absence of a body. Details that refused to settle. They remained, quietly, enough to keep the story from closing completely, enough to make some people hesitate before repeating it too confidently, but not enough to change it. That's how it stayed. Not fully true, not fully false. Balanced in a place where it could be passed down without being questioned too closely. Morgan didn't return. Not to correct it, not to change anything that was said about her. She remained where the story had left her, somewhere beyond reach. And without her there to answer for it, the version of her that remained belonged to everyone else, shaped by what they needed, adjusted to what they believed. Until eventually, the question was no longer what did she do, but something simpler, something easier to repeat. What was she? And the answer depended entirely on who was telling the story. Epilogue. Why her story still feels unfinished. There are stories that end cleanly, clearly, with a final moment you can point to and say, that was it. This was never one of them. Because even after everything, after the war, after Arthur, after the silence that followed, Morgan doesn't stay where the story leaves her. She drifts. Not through time the way people expect. Through memory. Ask 10 people who she was, you won't get the same answer twice. Some will tell you she was dangerous from the beginning, that everything she did led exactly where it was meant to. Others will say she was pushed there, that she saw something others refused to see and paid for it. Some won't choose at all. They'll pause, think about it longer than they expected, and that hesitation is where her story still lives. Because nothing about her ever settled completely. Not the way she learned, not the way she chose, not even the way she left. There are still places where her name feels closer than it should. Near water, mostly. Still lakes, quiet shores. The kind of places where sound doesn't travel the way it normally does. Stand there long enough, and it's easy to feel like something is just beneath the surface. Not moving, not waiting. Present. That feeling never quite went away. Neither did the question. Not the one people ask out loud, the other one. The one that sits just behind it. If she was only a villain, why was she the one he trusted at the end? If she was only a savior, why did everything fall apart around her? There's no clean answer, and maybe that's the point. Because some stories aren't meant to resolve. They stay open. Not unfinished, just uncontained. Morgan was never one thing long enough to be defined by it. Not the girl they once understood, not the woman they feared, not even the figure the story tried to turn her into afterward. She moved through all of it and never fully stayed in any of it. That's why she's still here. Not in the way legends usually survive, but in the way certain questions do. The ones you don't answer right away. The ones that stay with you a little longer than expected. So when you think about her now, don't try to settle it too quickly. Don't decide too fast what she was supposed to be. Let it sit for a moment. Because somewhere between the versions, between what was said, what was remembered, and what was left out, there's still something unresolved. And maybe that's why her story never really ends. It just waits for someone else to tell it again. If you stayed with this story to the end, I'm curious, what did you see in her? And if you want more stories like this, the kind that don't give easy answers, subscribe and stay a little longer. Thank you for listening. Yours, Lady Mythos.